First Great Awakening. And now we're going to kind of get into the meat of this pre-Civil War era. And I've been really looking forward to this presentation. We have with us an historian, Dr. Jonathan Butler, and he obtained his PhD in church history from the University of Chicago. He authored Softly and Tenderly Jesus is Calling, Heaven and Hell in American Revivalism. Interesting subtitle there. That was looking at 1870 to 1920 period, so a little bit later. But a lot of his focus academically in his writings has been on Millerism and Adventism, and so he'll be able to relate some of the broader reforms and revivals of this period to the Adventist context. He authored an essay, Adventism and the American Experience in the Rise of Adventism in 1974. So he's been thinking about this relationship between Adventist history and the broader context of American religious history and American history for a long time now. He also co-edited together with Ronald Numbers The Disappointed Millerism and Millenarianism in the 19th Century. So again, very on point with what we'll be talking about today. And then recently, he published an article in Spectrum entitled My Parents and Ellen White, History as Autobiography. So a little bit of a personal connection. So I'm excited to get into this topic today, and join me in welcoming Jonathan Butler.
Over here. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Mike. This is the book. I don't know if you guys have seen this, that you're building classes around. Daniel Walker Howe. It's fat. It's kind of book you hold the door open with. You know, you don't have a stop for your door. It's about 900 pages, but it's a lively read. So I'm not saying you're going to get to the end of it, Dr. Brandstater, but you'll get into it a long way.
Thank you.
And then you take a nap. And then you go back again and start, but it's...
Might get dropped.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I like this idea of building a class around a book, and I see this around Loma Linda a bit. It kind of puts the school in Sabbath school. And I like the idea that this is named the Roy Branson Legacy class. I have not been here, I think, since that formal name occurred there. And, I think when you think of Roy Branson, you don't necessarily think of the importance of Sabbath school for him. He's remembered for Spectrum, he was an associate dean here, he's written, institute he founded in Silver Spring. But Sabbath school is very important to him. And I remember going out to eat with him just before he came out here. And he said, the hardest thing about leaving Washington is leaving my Sabbath school. And it's like, and then when he got here, I think this made it a lot easier for him. He started this class, and he got his stride back. So, it is nice that it's named for him. I'm kind of a legacy of him, and I think, I look at Dave there, back manning the cameras. You're not going to bootleg this anywhere, are you? I mean, this is going to be kosher.
Right. We're going to make a lot of money on this video.
I'm sure I'm not going to see a bit of it. Dave is one of those people that I think is very much in debt to Roy. And a lot of ethicists that came out of the seminary. We were back at the seminary at the same time. And I took a class on the Seminar on American Religion from Roy. About 10 people in the class. And Ron Walden was in there. I remember, and Rick Rice was in the same class, and we read a book a week. It was a grind. We read a book a week, and then we had to write 2 pages on it, and we were all competing bitterly with each other to write the best paper. And Roy put us against each other for that reason. He loved that. He was kind of the Donald Trump of that class. You know? And but we were reading books on American religion, and we saw how Seventh-day Adventism was in a context. And it was kind of maybe the first time I'd seen that. And it was an epiphany for me. And I ended up going to graduate school and taking church history, which I would never have expected to do. I think I would have thought I'd go into theology or ethics or something else. And it was that class that did it. So, you know, I really owed him for that. I will mention just a little bit on the side of it. Now I'm going to talk about a half hour. Do you guys have the outline here? Yeah. So I've given you that so that, one, you sort of know where we are, and you won't lose hope. You know, I'll be talking and say, when is this guy going to quit? But you've got it right there. You'll know right where I am. Now, I'm not making much progress yet on that list, but I will. I will. So don't despair. But there's a chapter, and I don't know, Mike could tell me, I don't know if you're going to get to that, but the Age of Jackson is, if you get the book and want to read something that's, I think, very relevant to today, it's the chapter on the Age of Jackson. And people are trying to figure out this guy, Donald Trump. This is the second time I'm going to mention him. I think that's going to be about it. That's my quota for the day. But they go back a couple of hundred years to find somebody like Donald Trump, and Jackson is probably the closest you're going to get. And it's very, and of course Howe is writing a book without any awareness of, I don't want to say his name yet, but he's is that 4? Okay. That's it, I'm way over the quota. And, but Jackson is this combination of populist and authoritarian. And he's also sexist, and he's racist, and if you count the Native Americans as foreign, which Americans did at that time, you can call him a xenophobe. Now, a lot of good things came out of Jacksonianism, and a lot of things I think we recognize in our own history are Jacksonian. But he's the first president who was not from Virginia or from Massachusetts. So it's very kind of sort of anti-elite. So you will think you're reading the morning newspaper when you're reading that chapter, and he's just writing history. So it's an interesting one. Okay, this period is transformative for America. America went through a really seismic shift here, and it's also formative for Seventh-day Adventism. Now, I'm speaking generally about this book now. There's 2 revolutions that go on, and you'll see this thread through all the chapters you talk about. One is communication, and the other is transportation. And I just happened to be reading a book that's dealing with the contemporary revolution we're in today. And it's Thomas Friedman's book on Thanks for Being Late. And he's talking about the changes in technology. He also deals with globalization and climate change, all these 3 areas. And he says we're in a very accelerating time. Things happen much quicker now than they used to. And on technology, I'm only as far as technology now. And he's talking about Gordon Moore and the microchip, and how every 2 years the microchip doubled in capacity. And Moore predicted that. And it was Carver Mead who called that Moore's Law. Moore's Law. Accelerating change. Not the kind of change that you got in this period, but with a steamboat, you know, or a telegraph, but probably as amazing to them as the microchip is to us. What's interesting, and we're kind of threading American history and SDA history as we talk. Gordon Moore is the sort of the guru of this. Carver Mead became the Gordon and Betty Moore professor at Caltech and took Moore's ideas and ran with them. He's responsible for this silicon in the microchip. And he is hugely important as an innovator in this field. And he was a member of the Pasadena Seventh-day Adventist Church when I was there as a kid. He was my Pathfinder leader. Okay? You've got this huge revolution going on in technology, and here's this guy that was introduced us to C.S. Lewis when we were in our teens and stuff. So, Carver Mead, M-E-A-D. He was on the cover of Forbes magazine a few years ago called The Powerful Vision of Carver Mead, and they talked about his contribution to technology. He's considered kind of the prophet. Now, he moved away from Seventh-day Adventism, but yeah, he was there. Alvin Quirrell was there at the same time, who headed the Adventist Forum. So just an interesting kind of, anyway, here's an illustration of change. If the microchip were the Volkswagen Beetle, right? The microchip were the Volkswagen Beetle in 1971. Right? And if the Beetle changed as much as the microchip did between 1971 and now, here's what the Beetle could do. It could drive 300,000 miles per hour. It could run 2 million miles per gallon of gas. And gas would cost, if fuel efficiency went as well as a microchip, a gallon of gas would cost 4 cents. This is Moore's law applied to the Beetle. So you could get into a Volkswagen in 1971 on a tank of gas, and you could drive it the rest of your life on the same tank of gas. Okay? So that's change. In these revolutions in the communication, it's the telegraph, right? And that's the title of the book, What Hath God Wrought? It's the newspapers, magazines, books. Transportation, it's steamboats, it's railroads, canals, turnpikes, and so on. Distance was the first enemy for Americans. And it was communication and transportation that overcame this enemy of distance. Well, when you're reading this, all my scribblings in the margin of this book have to do with the Seventh-day Adventists. Because I'm thinking, yeah, they use communication, right? James White with his steam press, and the books that came out, and the pamphlets that came out of the magazines. Ellen White writing letters and articles and books. Canvassing, that kind of combines travel, transportation, and communication, right? You're going from door to door. You know, it's not a bookstore, right? You have to go to the door. And I did this, by the way. And that's the subject of a memoir right there. But you're also, you're selling books. No, you're not selling books. You're providing a service. You're providing a service. I sold the whole unit to a woman, had it all spread out on the floor. She bought it all. No solicitors on the door. And those are the houses you go to because the husband tacked that on there. Didn't want the guy selling his wife books. So those were the doors you went to. Laid out all the books. She bought them all. Set me up for a week. I just stayed under a tree and read books after that for a week because I had a big sale. And she said at the door when I was going out, "I'm so glad it was you, because when you came to the door, I thought it was a book salesman." The testimonies were very much, it turned Seventh-day Adventism into a small town. It drew that people together. It overcame that distance. And you read You know, if you were unfortunate, you read about yourself in the testimonies. You know, what your married life was like, and what your diet, how your diet had gone off of rails. You know, so, but that brought them together. Transportation, you see that Adventists moving from New England to Western New York to Michigan, the Yankee Zone, we call that. And Ron Graybill has told me that the reason they were moving was wheat rust. The wheat was diseased, and so they had to go. They couldn't live on their wheat in New England anymore. They had to go to New York. Then they had to go to Michigan. So you think they went out for evangelism, and that too was the reason they went. Michigan was very fruitful for that. But they also went because the wheat didn't grow anymore where they were. So.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. And he's got a great article on millenarians and money, which deals with this. We're talking about this chapter now, Awakenings in Religion and the Adventist Awakening, and you see both the communication and translation, the circuit riders, for example, moving from place to place, the evangelists, the camp meetings. Camp meetings are sort of a combination of transportation and communication. Separation of church and state. There was no national church with the First Amendment, but there were state churches. You could have Congregationalists and a state church in Massachusetts and in Vermont and Connecticut. So those died more slowly. And but they moved toward, and space was a factor in that space we're talking about, because if you didn't like being a Congregationalist in Massachusetts, you could move to Rhode Island, right? Or you could move down to Pennsylvania. That was not as possible in Europe, right? So that was that space becomes a factor there. Churches nurtured democracy. Women found a voice there, African Americans, the poor, immigrants. But it was all built around voluntarism. You didn't go to church because you had to or were forced to. You relied on voluntarism. And people thought this was going to be a disaster. It turned out to be a real boon. The American Temperance Society became a sort of paradigm for all the other voluntary cities. People drank a lot in America. They always did. The founding fathers drank a lot. They lived in a third world country as far as health. The water was terrible. They couldn't drink the water. So they drank beer. It's hard to, they're writing the Declaration of Independence and they're inebriated. You know, it's a weird image to us. But the American Temperance Society was necessary. Lyman Beecher's 5 daughters, to me, stand out. I want to put Ellen White at the table there. You know, I said, well, how would she fit in? I think she aspired to be Harriet Beecher Stowe. I think that's what she aspired to be, in a sense, an author that many people read. She was probably more like Catherine Beecher, who was the founder of home economics. And that would take some development. Sounds condescending. But she was more of a domestic feminist. A lot of her interests pattern after Catherine Beecher. But maybe a blend of the two. New ways of influencing people come out of this era. Education, literature, magazines, revivals, reforms. Seventh-day Adventists adopted these, right? They were a modern church in that sense. They took on the new methods. The Great Awakening, which you talked about last week, right? Great Awakening was considered supernatural. It was a miracle. People were surprised by it. Jonathan Edwards was surprised by it. So he's up there preaching about hellfire and brimstone, reading his text like a small paperback, staring at the rope, the bell rope in the back of the church. Absolutely no aspect, no It was just a text. And people fell into the aisles and were rioting and screaming, and they were surprised by his reaction. He was surprised by it, wondered whether it was okay now. The Second Awakening was very different, the Second Awakening in this period, because it was man-made in a sense. They believed that you could adopt certain methods to persuade people, and you could create a revival. Charles Finney approached revivals very different than Jonathan Edwards. Finney was a lawyer who went out into the woods and became born again. And he argued as an evangelist a lot like a lawyer. He was self-educated, but not badly educated. So I wrote into the margins, would that fit Ellen White? Right? Self-educated, but not badly educated. You're still awake now, aren't you? You're thinking about this. We're going to talk the last half hour, right? I'm going to be done here. You think I'm not going to finish? I got 7 minutes. The new measures were Finney's measures, protracted meetings. That was something new. Calling people out by name in the audience. That was new. The anxious bench, where you bring people up and you put them in all this distress and make them think about whether they're going to be converted or not. You remember being in academy and finding out there's going to be a call today. There's going to be a call. And how did you feel? I didn't feel good. I never liked the call. You know? I just couldn't figure that one out. I mean, if you're already in, why do you need to go down? If you don't go down, you lack faith. That was a hard one, the call. Well, these people, they were writhing. The shopkeeper's millennium is the fact that Finney drew the professional people. He drew the artisans. He drew the farmers and so on. People that were pretty well off. Oberlin College was where he did, spent most of his life after teaching, or after evangelism. He was a teacher there, and that was on the cutting edge of social and religious innovation. The Methodists now, turning to the Methodists from Finney. Finney tended to be ecumenical. He brought everybody in. The Methodists tended to be more denominational, right? And I think the SDAs are a little more like Methodism than like Finney in this period, in the sense that they're creating a denomination that is in some ways exclusive. The Methodists, circuit riders like Peter Cartwright, on horseback, in the wind, in the rain, fording streams, climbing hills. The circuit rider tended to be a monastic, in a sense, and showed up at your door, piercing eyes. Remember a song I learned when I was a kid about the Reverend Mr. Black. He rode easy in the saddle, he was tall and lean. First you thought nothing but a streak of mean could make a man look so downright strong. You know, that kind of guy. Preached hot hell in the freezing snow. That's a circuit rider. Camp meetings were part of this whole process. People were isolated. They lived on farms. It was a long way to the next farmhouse. They came to these camp meetings and saw thousands of people for the first time. A lot of them young. Young adolescent boys saw young adolescent girls for the first time, and a whole bunch of them. They used to say there were more souls conceived at these meetings than saved. I don't know, I wasn't there. The classes, the social classes where you had about 30 people in the room, you had exhorters speaking to the class, and people got up and gave their testimony. You haven't been to the class meeting for several weeks or several months. You had to get up and testify why not. Why have you been missing? What's going wrong with your life? And the testimony was bearing your soul. Ellen White's testimonies you know, her dad was an exhorter, Methodist exhorter. So she, as a child, listened to these all the time. But her testimonies are not really testimonies. She's not talking about her shortcomings. She's talking about your shortcomings. So hers are more exhortations. Those books ought to be called exhortations.
That's both sides.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If you're lucky. I mean, you want the expose. Oh, one of the great, to me, one of the great compilations now is and I don't have the title exactly right, the testimonies on adultery, divorce, sexuality. I think that guy, we were talking about this last week, I think it comes out of when the Z-file got released. Mostly ministers. She's mostly talking about ministers and their indiscretions. It's a great read. It's a great read. You won't read The Great Controversy for a while. You just, I gotta read it. I'm reading Ellen White now. Phoebe Palmer, very much like Ellen White, interested in perfection, sanctification. Methodist, more organization than theology. Wheels within wheels of organization, not so theologically innovative. The Bible was self-explanatory. You don't need theologians. You don't need biblical exegetes. You just read the Bible. Anybody can do this. Arminianism, the belief in free will. Social upward mobility. Methodists founded colleges, seminaries, and made people into professionals and skilled people. They created a middle class, and this is, many of them look back for the good old days when they were more rustic and poor and so on. The Christian movement is also kind of a cousin of Methodism, and they rejected creedal formalism. Alexander Campbell is a key figure here, Barton Stone. No creed but the Bible. You don't have to rely on these third, fourth century creeds, so just the Bible. Christian Connection, Disciples of Christ, the Churches of Christ, all of these are spin-offs. Now the idea was, you just read the Bible and you'll find out what you're supposed to believe. Of course it didn't turn out that way. People disagreed. How could you disagree if it's plain in the Bible? And they would start new churches, right? Mm-hmm. So this was kind of a scandal because they couldn't agree. James White and Joseph Bates came out of the Christian Connection Church, right? And Seventh-day Adventism, in a way, is another Christian church saying, oh, well, you guys couldn't agree, now we can. And so they got together in the Sabbath conferences and they tried to agree, and they couldn't agree. There'd be 10 of them together, 12 of them, they couldn't come to an agreement. And then Ellen White would say, well, this is the view, and so on. But that's one of the snarls of this period. Second Awakening, a great sort of begins, this era begins that upward trajectory of religion, which goes through the 19th century, 20th century. Religion does very well in America, way better than in Europe in this period. Now, the remainder of it is sort of the complexity of religion, and just to touch on them, and I think this is the kind of thing that would draw Roy out in the discussion, because there is this conflict, and he took one side of a lot of these, and he had an upward fight with people who took the other side. But individualism versus sense of a community. That's tension is all through this evangelicalism. Social conservatism versus moral responsibility. Okay, which one do you take? Interdenominational cooperation versus splitting churches. You empowered people with evangelism. Of course, women were empowered by it. Blacks were empowered by it. But you reform society, or you form an island of holiness off to the side. And you're thinking in your head right now, the wheels are turning, which one did the Seventh-day Adventists do? We come out of this background, and we come out of this conflict, right? And so which direction we go in, it may depend a good deal on the Seventh-day Adventists you're talking to. If you're talking to Dave Larson back there, or you talk to Roy Branson about this, you're going to hear one thing. Read Bull and Lockhart and Seeking a Sanctuary, you're going to maybe hear another interpretation of it. These voluntary associations were training ground for fuller citizenship. The temperance movement encouraged women's rights. And it's just a step right from the temperance movement and prohibition movement from the late 19th century to women's suffrage. Women found a means of self-expression through religion. It's hard for me not to say any of those lines without thinking of Ellen White. Without her Methodist background, and without the church's Methodist background, we would likely not have heard from any of these women. Okay, I got close, ran over a little bit. And I don't know how many of you have actually read this chapter, but that gives you a little overview. And now, talk about what you want to talk about.
I have no credentials in history or sociology, so I'll go ahead anyway. And when you talk about mobility and communication, is it merely coincidental that the United States Postal Service, which was essential for isolated believers to share ideas, was founded or really established in 1844? Okay.
Yeah, it's another good example of what.
And the second observation, I don't have a lot of data points, but if you trace the growth of Adventism as institutional across the country, it is about 2 years behind the advent of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And so Adventism arrived in California about 2 years, which means we didn't ride horseback. We waited for the train.
Yeah, interesting. You know, I was thinking when I was reading how that Ellen and James White met over a horse. She was with a guy who was going to James White to get a horse back. And he had it for them, and that's when they met. He had seen her, and they used the carriage and so on, but they used a canal boat down Erie. And Ellen White, I think, crossed the U.S. 29 times in her life, and this was mostly by rail. Yeah, which is what you're talking about. And yeah, it's hard to imagine. I mean, you need steamboat and so on. You need liners to think of foreign missions. You know, to get her down to Australia or to get her to Europe. You know, but yes, I think what you're talking about is the very thing that interests me, namely the sort of social sources of a lot of this stuff. That's what you're bringing up by bringing up
the enabling context.
Yes, yeah, right.
And it's economic too.
Yes, and the notion we think of them when we look back on Seventh-day Adventism, we think of it as archaic, or these people are kind of, you know, by our standards, old-fashioned. But in their own time, they were modern, and they tied into these changes and progression.
They were more mobile, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Two things quickly. First of all, the correct title of your bestseller here is Testimonies on Sexual Behavior, Adultery and Divorce.
Oh,
1980.
fantastic. It moves me just to hear the title.
Now, I want to follow up on this post office business, because I was thinking, you mentioned all these communications, the steam press and all
Yeah.
that. But Ellen White was an inveterate letter writer, constantly writing and constantly receiving letters. And the advent of the post office made that possible in a way that never had been before. I always remember a letter a woman wrote to the Review. She said, "We are a lonely few in the backwoods of Saginaw."
That's a good one.
And these people then, they're writing letters to the Review, which James and Ellen White have access to, not just the letters that get in the Review, but all the letters that were not put in the Review.
Yes, yeah.
And then they publish these letters or excerpts from these letters in the review. So all the readers of the review are in communication with all the other members, even if they are in the backwoods of Saginaw. And then you didn't mention the quarterly meetings. Those are another thing. Those smaller group, maybe a camp meeting annually, but a quarterly meeting everything. So they kept bringing
which is
them together.
Methodist, too, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Mormons did it differently. They said, let's all get together and let's all go to Zion and or wherever. But Adventists, through communication and transportation, were able to keep together and build a movement.
Yeah, this notion of a scattered flock, which gets coined, I think, back in New England, but the idea that you're spread out. You're not just getting to the next farmhouse, you're getting to the next Adventist farmhouse. But your point, now, you've made it to me privately, so I'm going to out you now, I think, about this. But this notion of the review is this kind of nerve center, all these letters coming in, and they don't publish them all, but it's very likely that Ellen White could have read many more than were actually published. And James could come home and say, hey, we got this letter from so-and-so. And then Ellen White could write about that. She could address that and appear prescient, or, wow, how did she know? God told her. Well, no, it was an unpublished letter. I mean, I'm being irreverent here, but that's, I do think that Ellen White, and this is germane to this, was very much in the loop. She traveled everywhere. She met with people. She would arrive at a place and there'd be some furor going on. A woman who had too many flowers in her bonnet. You know what I'm talking about? That's serious. Especially if she's a minister's wife. Too many flowers in the bonnet. Well, she would come, she would know these things and know about it before she got there.
Well, I mean, without saying that these letters were the basis for what she claimed to have seen in vision, these letters would have given her context and applications for the things that she sees in vision. So she
this is why you lasted as long as you did at the White Estate. See the way you finessed that? Just beautiful. Just beautiful, Yeah, but that's right.
Butler said provisions were based on letters from members.
Exactly.
And Graybill said, no, that just helped her interpret.
Yeah, right. I know. No, that's being generous, but I think, and without getting all into the visions, but just this, to stay on topic, just this network of communication. These.
And the review acted, from what I'm hearing from Ron, acted kind of like a blog. And now we have much faster blogs.
Yes.
That with the decline of grammar and civility.
Yeah. But the church has got its own blogs too.
Oh yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think if we think of our internet and our Facebook and all that, and then look back through that filter to what they were involved, their kind of communication, there's parallels in the sense that,
because you've written on a later period about revivalism, the latter half of the 19th century, early 20th century, and I haven't read your writing on that. I'm just curious what your impression is about this pre-Civil War, Second Great Awakening period of revivalism compared to that latter period.
Yeah, I mean, I would rather be the product of this period, the Second Awakening, than be a product of the Third Awakening after the Civil War. Things, evangelicalism divided there, and a lot of the turn of the century became a fundamentalist modernist division. And a lot of evangelicalism was sort of captive to the fundamentalists. Now, Dwight Moody was amazingly non-ideological. He was a pretty expansive guy personally. But to me, this period is transformative, not just for evangelicalism, but for America. And they were part of it. This was not backwater. This anti-slavery, health, women's rights come out of this period. Whereas in the later period, it's a little more tendentious and I think divisive and at times enclavish and backward. I mean, I'm being a little harsh with the later period.
I'd like to ask about Charles Grandison Finney. I read his autobiography when I was 18 years old, and it changed my life.
Amazing, yeah.
It really did.
Yes.
I'd come out of a very protected Adventist family. Here I was getting first-person account of what happened to that man who was no dummy, as you well know.
Yeah.
And this gave me perhaps a glimpse of what revival can be, of what the final Reformation can be. But it didn't last forever. What happened to Finney when he went to Oberlin? He seemed to have lost steam somehow.
Well, he ceased being, I guess it's sort of like this business, going from charisma to what the sociologists said, charisma to routinization. You know, you can't remain charismatic and sort of forever, right? You tire out. But I think Oberlin, in its own way, is a very powerful and meaningful legacy. I mean, that's a college. It's still with us, but I mean, it's a college that was quite innovative educationally, socially for its time. So he was not out stumping for evangelism, but I think it's maybe less inspiring and more institutional, but I think it's still, probably at 18 years old, you would not have been inspired by a history of Oberlin College. You needed Finney and his life to inspire you, and I can understand that. But
what I read about Oberlin today sounds as if they've forgotten that Finney ever lived.
well, yes, yeah.
It's a different institution.
Sure.
Although in the city of Rochester, Finney is still alive.
Interesting.
Well, the big churches there, with Finney's name on them.
Interesting, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now Oberlin would be a liberal arts.
Very much so.
Yeah, liberal arts institution, which, no parochial sense.
And no revivalism.
No, that's right. But that's interesting, you, at 18, that you read that book.
Oh, it blew me away.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And it's in the first person. He wrote it himself. Whereas the revivals the lectures on revivals were taken down by a secretary, who did shorthand very well.
Dr. Brandstater knows the story, but I was just a little over 18. And I was in Beirut at Middle East College in the year 66, 67, and he was at the American University, and he showed up on campus in his all whites. He looked like a tall John Harvey Kellogg. And very, very spiffy, and I was inspired by the fact that he was teaching at the American, not a parochial person, but a cosmopolitan man. And he came and he spoke at our commencement. I was impacted by this man at that time, and my memories remain fond.
It's never been the same, John.
You were my Finney.
Following that question, why does so much of this happen? There's two questions. Why does so much of this happen in upstate New York? And what was special about upstate New York where all this stuff was happening?
And Western New York.
Western New York.
Yeah. Well, a great book on that is by Whitney R. Cross, C-R-O-S-S, called The Burned Over District. And it's Cross was a student at Harvard of Arthur Schlesinger Sr., whose his son worked for Kennedy. But one of the great historians, Harvard historian. And Cross did this book on all the religious groups that were going on in Western New York, like the Mormons, like the Seventh-day Adventists, Millerites, the Shakers. It's a huge ferment of these communities, and he tries to break down why. One thing, they were young. They tended to be young. The population, the under 35s there, were the vast majority of people. And you know how people, young, what they're like. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, he does a kind of a sociology of it as well as a religious, it's a complicated question, and it eventually, I mean, it's burned over by the revivalism event. You know, you're moving through that, and it's like a fire. But ultimately, things get burned to stubble, and you have to go to Michigan to find your burned over district, which is what the Seventh-day Adventists did. They were seekers, and they were looking for something new. So they were sort of disestablished from the East Coast, from the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians and the established religions, and they were moving out from their parents. You know, they were settlers, but they were adventurers too. And so I'm not giving you a very good answer. It's a complicated story, but I think if you're interested, that's the book for you. Now, it was written in about 1950, but it still is the book that people use.
The other question I have is, why did Adventism, I'm not sure I'm correct in this, but why did Adventism sort of come at the end of this period and not in the middle or the beginning of it? They're sort of late in that second revival kind of period.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you date the Second Awakening. You date it from around 1800, the Cane Ridge revivals down in Kentucky. But you can date it as late as the 1840s. And Millerism you can see as a kind of a last, sort of a remnant of these revivals, in a way. And we were talking about new measures and the techniques that Finney used. I think of the time setting of the Millerites as a new measure. In other words, we need to rekindle the fire. The Second Awakening is languishing a bit. How do we do that? Well, if we preach about a particular time, the Lord's coming about 1843, or the Lord is coming on October 22, 1840, a day, what does that do? Well, that gets people pretty excited. And it is defended, Ellen White defends it by saying, you know, it was right to preach a definite time because of what it did for the people. It got them back to the Bibles, and it also converted them, right? So you're justifying a new measure. Pragmatic, you're saying. It worked, right? And Finney would tell you that if you criticize Finney on one of his new measures, he would say, yeah, but look at all these people that are coming down here and converting. But yeah, you're talking Seventh-day Adventism, I think you could argue, is a product of the enthusiasm and the ferment of the Second Awakening, at least the late Second Awakening. But it institutionalizes, right? It has to survive. Ellen White changes. She's not an ecstatic teenager her whole life. She becomes a church leader, a prophet, and she changes a good deal, and even disavows some of the things that happened in those early days. So, but I think it's more of a historical, I mean, it just happened historically that way. But there's a lot of people in that Second Awakening that ended in obscurity. You know, we don't hear about it. A lot of churches died away. A lot of social experiments gone. But Seventh-day Adventism came out of that. Same kind of ferment, maybe a late stages of it, but they're still here. So that becomes an interesting question. How did they survive and the Shakers not, or Brook Farm didn't, or Oneida didn't, You know, that kind of. Mormons survived, of course.
The second half of the 19th century was a time of great transformation in the United States. You mentioned the revolution in communication,
Yes.
the revolution in transportation, and I would add that the United States was competing for #1 industrial power in the world with Germany at the end of the century.
Yeah.
In your view, I mean, we understand that there were a lot of eccentric things happening in this Great Awakening. But in your view, the overall influence was a positive. How these Great Awakenings were contributing to the, let's say, moral fabric of the society and the impact on the society, let's say the formation of political powers and industrialization and all this progress that was made in America during this time.
Yeah, you remind me of Henry Adams, who's in the Adams family tradition. He entered Harvard in 1856, and in 1900 he wrote his autobiography, Education of Henry Adams. And he said, when I entered Harvard in 1856, I was as close to the year 1 as I was to the year 1900. In other words, as much happened in the next 45 years as it happened in 1900 and 55 years before, which is, that goes back to that microchip thing. There was this accelerating change, this huge, huge change. And I think, I'm not sure where you're going with the question, but I do think this point that Howe makes, that religion very much thrives in America. And it thrives through the 19th century and through the 20th century. Now, it's criticized for being shallow. It's criticized for being non-intellectual. A lot of this evangelical type religion, right? But as far as its energy and its the massive numbers of people that it engages, I think is you have to take it as a hugely important. There's a columnist for the New York Times named, I don't know how you say his name, but Douthat, D-O-U-T-H-A-T, and he wrote a book called Bad Religion, and it's a really good book, talking about American religion, and how Americans tend to forget their history, they tend to forget their indebtedness to the past in the area of religion, right? They want to reinvent religion all the time. Now we're into the spirituality a lot. You know, people are less interested in the churches, right? And you talk to them, they're pretty wide open, pretty rudderless in a lot of ways. And he's criticizing. He's a Catholic, by the way. He's a Catholic, fairly conservative Catholic, and conservative politically. But I have a feeling I might be missing what you're.
What I was interested to know your opinion if overall these awakenings, they have a positive role on the society and everything that happened were a negative role.
Yeah, I have my favorites among the awakenings. I would say my favorite probably would be the Second Awakening. Of course, I come out of that background. And then second would be the Great Awakening with Edwards, because of Edwards. He was maybe one of the great intellects in American history. But I'm a little more critical of what would be called the Third Awakening from maybe the turn of the century, the 19th or 20th century, and the sort of the Billy Sundays and the Dwight Moody, and the Billy Graham phenomenon, in the 50s. I think there was a little too much collusion between society and religion, between politics. In the Second Awakening, you're transforming your environment. In the 50s, you're becoming best friends with the president and blending into your environment. I would rather see more transformative. But it depends on the person. and depends on the period, I think.
But isn't the overall moral fiber in society benefiting from some of these awakenings? Is society as a whole better? Are people's lives better because of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make that argument that the very last, and this may be, I should have probably, I should have printed this on the outline because it's a little harder to read, but to hear out loud. But right at the end of the chapter on Awakenings of Religion, Howe quotes Sidney Alstrom, who was a Yale professor of religion and was Sterling Yale and the most important American religion scholar of his time. And he said, our final conclusion, and this is he's answering your question, our final conclusion regarding all of these social results, good, bad, and questionable, is that in one sense, they are only side effects of efforts that were ineffable and beyond mundane measuring. For the missionaries and church founders came above all to minister the consolations of religion, to bring word of amazing grace to wretched souls. In what measure they succeeded in that primary task, God only knows. Right. But this is a religious historian looking at that, you know. And yeah, I think you can say good things about this period. Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking Dr. Butler. We're going to have a couple more presentations in a few weeks, digging into this period further. Dr. Graybill is going to be talking some about millennial movements and utopian movements and other fascinating things coming out of this period. And Dr. Valentine will look into the whole issue of education. And then later we'll talk about the Transcendentalists, a very different movement at the same time. But next week, we're going to step back in time a little bit between the two awakenings, first and second Great Awakening, and look at the period of the nation's founding, the founders and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and some of the Enlightenment thinking that was present, but also how that reacted with some of the more evangelical Christianity coming out of the First Awakening, and with a specific focus on religious liberty and how that evolved at the time. A very, very important development in American history and in world history. So Forrest is going to be leading out in that next week. He's read several books on this topic and takes a great interest in it. Let's see, what was I going to say? Oh yes, related to that, just sort of an aside, it was just President's Day, you know, this Monday, right? This last Monday, and this is one of these terrible 3-day weekend, you know, hybridized holidays that take all the meaning out of the original holidays, in my opinion, like Memorial Day. But originally there was a celebration annually by a lot of people, particularly in the North, on the Federalist territories, of Washington's birthday. And it was traditional often to read Washington's farewell address on that day. And so my wife and I decided to go ahead and read Washington's address. And I thought of it because of your question and Peter's, where he talks quite a bit about the view at that time, and his view of the importance of morality to the stability and good functioning, particularly of a democratic society, and the importance of religion to morality. That I remembered, but there was also a seemingly very timely warning about the dangers of bitter partisan politics and how the kind of revenge cycles of this sort of partisan politics could, and I remembered that part too from before, but I forgot about this part, that it could lead the people to cry out for a strong hand to take away all this dysfunction and lead into the future. What's that?
Let's hope that never happens.
Yeah, I hope not. But anyway, I mentioned this to encourage you to read the farewell address, and also to encourage you to remember how much all of these historical developments still have resonance and relevance for today.
I was just going to comment that both after the French Revolution and in recent times in China, government leaders have recognized that the best citizens are those who have a religion, and even though China would like to control it, of course, they have publicly agreed that the best citizens are those who have Christian religion or Buddhism or something, to believe in. So that's still the way it is.
Yeah, any system may be a system of structures and laws, but it is also a system of people. And there has to be something, I think, in the human element. So thank you all. I think Dr. Larson had made these, but I don't know if you want to pass these around. These are the benediction. You probably know some of it by heart. This is from Numbers 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. So you want to pass a few of those around. And the rest of you will have to wing it.
Yeah.
I think we know it. So we'll just join together in saying this benediction from Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.